Hello, and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is part three in a series of videos regarding structuralism as an intellectual movement in the early to mid 20th century. So we dealt with Ferdinand de Saussure in depth in a previous video, and I'm going to treat a bit of Levi-Strauss here. But Claude Levi-Strauss wrote so much material that I'm just giving you a really small snippet. I'm also not going to delve into the particulars of his examples in what I go over today. And this comes because I have close relationships to some indigenous thinkers who really challenge Levi-Strauss for various reasons. It is not my purpose today to air those critiques. We can do that later on. But to move forward with just this idea of what structuralism is, and I think the important thing for what I'm trying to do is to show people how thinkers in different disciplines end up taking on similar ideas and running with them in their own particular fields. Now, this can be good or bad depending on what your perspective is. But if we're trying to do this thing called critical theory, then I think that that's one of the ways that theory works. It is a kind of meta discourse, although I don't know if it is a meta language. And so that's a technical term that we've been talking about a little bit and that we'll get back to with Roland Barthes. So just to sum up a couple of things before going into Levi-Strauss, structuralism with Saussure was linguistically based, but we saw some parallels already with, say, Sigmund Freud and the idea of the unconscious. And we see structuralism as a movement that is arriving in the 20th century in some ways in reaction to the scientific positivism of the 19th century, Auguste Comte being one of them, but also, we could throw in figures like Darwin, the development of biological sciences, the increasing shift between those types of ways of analyses and cultural types of ways of analyses. And this will be very important, I think, for contemporary discussions about race, which we haven't gotten into yet. But I think that when we look back and we look at the ways that the sort of social sciences develop as disciplines, and how what happens is not one discussion about race, but many, and they're conflicting, and that constitutes or at least contributes to the murkiness of dealing with subjects like race in the 21st century. And also the notions of culture that we tend to take for granted, especially because I think that we have kind of pop discourses or ways of thinking about some of these figures. So I think, for example, like people have a lot of ideas about Sigmund Freud without ever having read very much of Sigmund Freud. Maybe that's less of the case with Saussure because he's not as famous outside of like kind of scholastic circles. He hasn't had this sort of pop culture influence. But as I mentioned in my previous video, and as Paul Fry has mentioned in his literary theory lectures, you can look them up on YouTube or I think in podcast form, his literary theory course at Yale, because Saussure's lectures were sort of put together not by himself, but after he died by his students. He demonstrates what Michel Foucault will later call the author function, right? And we'll have videos that are dedicated to that later on in the series. But from the start, it's like that we tend to think of an author as having power. We refer to someone like William Shakespeare and his power and influence over the English language, but we're not necessarily thinking, we don't know that much about his biography, for example. There have been people who've attempted to put life together, and I think Will in the World is a book that I've mentioned a lot by Stephen Greenblatt that I admire. But still, we just don't have a lot. There's the cultural idea of Shakespeare and his influence on, say, high school curriculum in the United States, or right perceptions of the development of the English language in a different sort of context. And that's not necessarily the same thing that we mean by an individual author. So there's the idea of the author, right? The idea of Proust, the idea of James Joyce, and that becomes a kind of different way of noting what authority is. Um, uh, and with Saussure, I think we got a lot of that, uh, a sense of what that is. But with Claude Levi-Strauss, in contrast, there's just so much like material that he produced over his very long life. Uh, qualifications aside, then I'm going to jump in here. I'm mostly just going to deal with one chapter from a book called Structural Anthropology. And uh, really, my point here is just to see a little bit of continuity between a thinker like Claude Levi-Strauss and Roland Barthes, who we'll get to in a later lecture, and earlier structuralist thinkers like Saussure. So Roland Barthes, when we get to him, is very aware of Levi-Strauss's work, and that's why I think I needed to throw him into this series, even though I'm just taking a tiny snippet of him. I think one of the things that I've talked about is that structuralism as a intellectual movement, especially in France in the mid 20th century, especially after World War II with the development of the Fourth Republic, there is this massive, deep-seated cultural critique going on in the rebuilding of France after Nazi occupation. And is there a sort of possibility at that point to move beyond the kind of classism that was such a part of the Third Republic? So that's one of the political questions, I think, that is driving and motivating some of the intellectual work here. Now, we know that in general, structuralist thought tended toward Marxian thought to begin with. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we could think of Marx as a proto-structuralist, because he has this very modeled sense of the way that history moves through class struggle in a dialectical material process that pushes toward these revolutionary moments, right? And you can hear a little bit of Hegel behind Marx there. And so I think that in some ways, when we think about structuralism in relation to the broader concept of critical theory, if you've watched my other talks on what do we call critical, what is critical theory today, is one of the questions I started out in my talks for the Center of Critical Theory. And in that sense, I was dealing with the Frankfurt School and the German folks who are contemporaries of these French guys, but they are having a discussion about like why, for example, a Marxian revolution didn't happen in Germany. Why didn't it cascade, especially during the crises of the late 1920s that produce not a Marxian revolution, but this National Socialist thing, right? So the specter of National Socialism, Nazism, is definitely at work here. And there's a lot of trying to think, where did Marx get it wrong? Is there something salvageable about Marxian theories and the left that can speak to oppression and that can speak to the devastation that has occurred throughout the whole continent? Of course, at the same time, it loosens Europe's colonial holds or classical colonial holds. And so we're seeing all sorts of revolutionary movements across North Africa over into India, claims of nation states declaring independence from their former European powers, and then ongoing stuff with the Middle East, of course, right? That goes back to the end of World War I and still continues to be an issue for us living in the world today, right? Except that when we live in the world today, and we look at the Middle East or hear about the Middle East constantly. If you're listening to national public radio, the politics are in such a small part of the world, but they impact us globally. I think in ways that 150 years ago, conflicts in the Middle East were not sort of having those types of global impact because they didn't have like nuclear weapons behind them and stuff like that, right? So we are living in a little bit of a different moment. So Claude Levi-Strauss was very romantic, I think, in this kind of movement towards Karl Marx and Marxian thought that tried to recover a kind of humanist Marx. I've mentioned it at various times that Marx's work wasn't completely translated, and for many folks until the 1930s. And so there's a kind of return to Marx, especially to the early Marx, that is inspiring to many thinkers. Now, later Marxist thinkers like Louis, like Althusser, for example, they're going to push beyond that kind of romanticized sense. So I just want to mention that that's out there. And this is not a series on Marxism so much, but it is a series on structuralism, which tends to lean left. So the question really is, and I think in these European, I will even say Euro-Christian in many cases, thinkers, is how does a society structure itself? How does a society rebuild itself after a war? Those are all questions. To what extent can we, if we are rebuilding a society, can we make it better than what was before? Is the motivating question. And I think those, when you bring it into the 21st century, like that's why we're reading this stuff. It's not just sort of a trip down 20th century history lane. It's really sort of looking at these thinkers and thinking about how they tried to deal with their social, cultural, world, political problems during their time, and what were the resources and methods that they drew on to do that. And structuralism has a kind of continuity across disciplines because I think many of these folks were dealing with similar problems from their respective areas of expertise. So Levi-Strauss leaves France, though, and goes to South America, and he sees in his encounters with indigenous people, and I'm going to use the term Euro-Christian here, following my friend Tink Tinker here, and I don't think that structuralism ever, to echo my indigenous colleagues, ever sort of leaves the Euro-Christian worldview. I think that when we see something like structuralism in these discourses, what is important is actually to situate it in a European worldview and a European context, even when it's Europeans who are going out to other continents in the world and trying to make sense of kind of globalized, or in some in a hackneyed sense, like universal ideas. Right. So Levi-Strauss goes and he is enamored with indigenous societies that he studies. And when he comes back to France, the discussions that are going on in France are really something that he is disenchanted from, I think, as a thinker as well. And so that leads him to be a little bit of an outlier in broader sort of the moment of structuralism, but it also sets him up to be doing some of the critiques that come to be known as post-structuralism as well. So he, over time, as I say in my notes here, he found the political situation in France less relevant and became disillusioned with the political discussion there. But his conclusions are of importance for politics and for what becomes post-structuralism. And before jumping into my notes here, I wanted to just mention a couple of things from earlier on in his essay here. First of all, we get a little bit of a note from the translator here, Claire Jacobson or Jacobson. On page 10 in the beginning. and I liked it because it was just a short description of structuralism. Uh, she says, how does structural analysis proceed? The first step is the definition of the constituent units of an institution. These are conceptually equivalent to the phonemes or morphemes of a language and therefore comparable cross-culturally. Once the various aspects of culture have been reduced to their structural elements, relationships of opposition and correlation and permutation and transformation among these elements can be defined. Homologies between institutions within the same society or among various societies can be explained not in terms of a mechanical causality, but rather in dialectical terms. Correspondences or isomorphisms should be sought not between empirical data pertaining to different institutions, but between systematized forms or models which are abstracted on different levels and which can be compared either intra or cross culturally. To Levi-Strauss, the building of such models is the basic aim of anthropology. Really nice kind of summing up there, and what you can already hear there with the echoes of morphemes and phonemes. If you watched my earlier lecture, you can see that that's where he's moving. Now, what he's doing is trying to do some sort of cross-cultural analysis. And I think that that's where some of this structuralism becomes problematic for indigenous colleagues of mine, like Tinker, who will say, like, well, at least one of the critiques is that the ways that the Europeans kind of are looking at language itself, even between phonemes and morphemes, but especially the way European languages are structured in terms of nominative, like naming or noun-based languages, versus verbal languages, like many of the languages of Turtle Island, especially up north here where I live, and to a certain extent, although I have less knowledge of southern indigenous contexts, although I will bring up the Popol Vuh in a second here. That when we have verbal-based languages, that they work differently, and they work differently cognitively. But that gets us into much later discussions that happened like in the late 20th century, in terms of cognitive theory and cognitive science. We're going to get there in these lectures, and that's why I'm mentioning them. But I want you to just sort of hold that aside right now so that we can kind of understand what is driving someone like Levi-Strauss, and that's what I'm motivated in almost reading theory, or these theoreticians like they're novelists, and like so you might have a 19th century novelist expert or 19th century literature expert who reads in the period, and that's what I'm doing too. I'm really just like looking at these thinkers who are contributing to this body of thing called theory, and trying to make sense from their respective areas of expertise, as I said earlier. So if we turn to the actual essay in the structural study of myth in Claude Levi-Strauss's book here, he opens with this quote by Franz Boas, another important structuralist and anthropologist. It would seem, says Boas, that it would seem that mythological worlds have been built up only to be shattered again, and that the new worlds were built from the fragments. Then Levi-Strauss opens up the essay kind of talking about the problems that exist in the study of myth as he's writing. And this is like mid 20th century, right? He says, despite some recent attempts to renew them, it seems that during the past 20 years, anthropology has increasingly turned from studies in the field of religion. At the same time, and precisely because the interest of professional anthropologists has withdrawn from primitive religion, all kinds of amateurs who claim to belong to other disciplines have seized this opportunity to move in thereby turning into their private playground what we had left as a wasteland. The prospects for the scientific study of religion have thus been undermined in two ways. So this is like really important to sort of think about, like that 19th century anthropology, and I think he's thinking of people like Friedrich Max Mueller here, and comparative mythology, comparative religion, which emerges in the late 1800s, and then informs earlier mythological thinkers, um, uh, like Fraser, for example, of the Golden Bough, um, early 20th century, massive, long books about mythology that cross over into ideas of religion. But he says that anthropology in mid 20th century moves increasingly away from the study of religion and into something else. And in the meantime, he's complaining about these amateurs that have come in. So he says, the explanation for this situation lies to some extent in the fact that anthropological study of religion was started by men like E.B. Tylor, James Fraser, Emile Durkheim, who were psychologically oriented although not in a position to keep up with the progress of psychological research and theory. Their interpretations, therefore, soon became vitiated by the outmoded psychological approach, which they used as their basis. Although they were undoubtedly right in giving their attention to intellectual processes, the way they handled these remained so crude that it discredited them altogether. So he recognizes, that there a lot of these attempts to be scientific about religion were ill-conceived. And he also particularly wants to say that the psychological approaches were not particularly well suited. So he's not going to be like in the Freud camp, right? He's definitely not going to be in the Jung camp, as we'll see later on in this essay. But he says they were on to something basically, but they fell short. He says this is much to be regretted, since, as Hocart so profoundly noted in his introduction to a posthumous book recently published, psychological interpretations were withdrawn from the intellectual field only to be introduced again in the field of affectivity, thus adding to, quote, the inherent defects of the psychological school, the mistake of deriving clear-cut ideas from vague emotions. Instead of trying to enlarge the frameworks of our logic to include processes which, whatever their apparent differences, belong to the same kind of intellectual operation, a naive attempt was made to reduce them to inarticulate emotional drives, which resulted in hampering our studies. And then he goes on here, of all the chapters of religious anthropology, probably none has tarried to the same extent as studies in the field of mythology. From a theoretical point of view, the situation remains very much the same as it was 50 years ago, namely chaotic. Myths are still widely interpreted. Again, this is mid-20th century. Myths are still widely interpreted in conflicting ways as collective dreams, as the outcome of a kind of aesthetic play, or as the basis of ritual. Mythological figures are considered as personified abstractions, divinized heroes, or fallen gods. Whatever the hypothesis, the choice amounts to reducing mythology either to idle play on the one hand, or to a crude kind of philosophical speculation. And so he goes on to say that he wants to advance a structural study of myth, and that is going to be the way that we can have a solid scientific study in the 20th century, and not fall back into psychological abstraction of earlier thinkers, and then not be taken over by amateurs who are just kind of tourists in the field of psychology, for example. He says on page 208, mythology confronts the student with a situation which at first sight appears contradictory. On the one hand, it would seem that in the course of a myth, anything is likely to happen. There's no logic or continuity. Any characteristic can be attributed to any subject. Every conceivable relation can be found. With myth, everything becomes possible. But on the other hand, this apparent arbitrariness is belied by an astounding similarity between myths collected in widely different regions. Therefore, the problem, if the content of myth is contingent, how are we going to explain the fact that myths throughout the world are so similar? It's a really great research question, and I think it's a worthy one, even if like contemporary critics, my indigenous colleagues especially, are going to point out the flaws of a thinker like Levi-Strauss or the limits to the ways that he's conceiving his study. I think that that's an ongoing question. And I think that the ways that we answer that question have profound impacts on the ways that we think about different cultures in the world, because already he's bringing this Euro-Christian concept to the study of myth by saying, like, we should have some way to account for everybody in the world, right? That sort of globalized impulse is very much part of like the UN moment that's kind of helping to fund some of his trips, like the UNESCO, the development of UNESCO at the end of World War II, but also just an older tradition among European thinkers to try to conceive of everything or in the world or all of humanity. Um, so he certainly doesn't escape that kind of impulse. What he does here is then he shifts to these comparisons that he'll make a number of times through to linguistic analysis. So he says it's precisely this awareness that a basic antinomy pertaining to the nature of myth that may lead us toward its solution. For the contradiction which we face is very similar to that which in earlier times brought considerable worry to the first philosophers concerned with linguistic problems. Linguistics could only begin to evolve as a science after this contradiction had been overcome. Ancient philosophers, he says, reasoned about language the way that we do in the 20th century about mythology. On the one hand, they did notice that in a given language, certain sequences and sounds were associated with definite meanings, and they earnestly aimed at discovering a reason for linkage between those sounds and the meanings. Their attempt, however, was thwarted from the very beginning by the fact that the same sounds were equally present in other languages, although the meaning they conveyed was entirely different. The contradiction was surmounted only by the discovery that it is the combination of sounds and not the sounds themselves which provides the significant data. Now, this is going to hopefully, maybe you can think back to the previous lecture for Saussure and how he starts developing the idea that first that language is arbitrary, that's the sonically languages are arbitrary, and that so we have a little bit of a distinction between the morpheme and the phoneme, for example, that needed to be developed. And the other thing, I would say, if we're going to go back, is that if you think of that structure that is so much a part of Saussurean thought, which is the signifier signified unit, right? Which it has the two sides, but it can't be separated. In terms of his idea, and then he develops that into the syntagma. Remember, so he goes on. It's easy to see, moreover, that some of the more recent interpretations of mythological thought originated from the same kind of misconception under which those early linguists were laboring. Let's consider, for example, Jung's idea that a given mythological pattern, the so-called archetype, possesses a certain meaning. This is comparable to the long supported error that a sound may possess a certain affinity with a meaning. For instance, the liquid semivowels with water, the open vowels with things that are big, large, loud, or heavy, etc. A theory which still has its supporters. Whatever emendations of the original formation may now call for, everybody will agree that the Saussurean principle of the arbitrary character of linguistic science was a prerequisite for the accession of linguistics to the scientific level. So just to say one, like, I think that in some ways we could, if we're thinking about structuralism, we could maybe think about someone like Jung and throw him into the discussion, just like we could throw Freud into the discussion with the Oedipal complex. But the archetype, it might be a kind of structure, but for Levi-Strauss, this is like bunk. So he goes on to, he says, to invite the mythologist to compare his precarious situation with that of the linguist in this pre-scientific stage is not enough. As a matter of fact, we may thus be led only from one difficulty to another. There is a very good reason for why myth cannot simply be treated as language if its specific problems are to be solved. He says, myth is language. To be known, myth has to be told. It is a part of the human speech. In order to preserve its specificity, we must be able to show that it is both the same thing as language and also something different from it. Here, too, the past experience of linguists may help us, for language itself can be analyzed into things which are at the same time similar and yet different. This is precisely expressed in Saussure's distinction between langue and parole, between language and speech, right? One being the structural side of language, langue, the other the statistical aspect of it, langue belonging to a reversible time, parole being non-reversible. Parole is in time because it's speech, just like you're having to sit in time for the unfolding of my words as I'm talking right now in order to experience them. If those two levels already exist in language, then a third one can be conceivably isolated. So this is going to be the pattern that we see throughout structuralist thought over and over again. I've mentioned it a little bit in earlier lectures. So there's going to be this kind of cross diagram, and there's going to be on the horizon, or like the horizontal level, we're going to be moving through time in a kind of linear way. But that's always going to be compared against a background vertical kind of structure that is more static in nature, that we can almost, like as Saussure said, almost like you could take a picture of it and then start constructing from that particular moment in time, and maybe trying to get back to the past time, like the philologists or the euhemerists like to do, to get a historical sense of mythology or language. Now, I feel like Levi-Strauss is going to say that we don't get a lot in this essay about sort of that linear development of history over time so much, except that at the end, he wants to make it very, very clear that so-called primitive man, or the indigenous peoples that he's been studying, are in no way inferior to so-called modern people, right? And in that sense, for his time, I think he's overcoming some ethnocentrism and some perceptions that are like rampant throughout Euro-Christian culture at the time. So maybe we could applaud Levi-Strauss for those types of attributes to his thinking, and also note at the same time that there, especially with his approach to indigenous peoples, there are some severe limitations that we now know from later thought as well. But I think that that's what Levi-Strauss is saying is that myth is a different kind of set of tools, and it shouldn't be thought of as in any way inferior to sort of current discourse in the sciences, right? Because they're different tools. They're made out of different things, even if they look like similar tools, like the tool for explaining how things work in the world, right? And so at the end of the essay, he compares the stone axe to the metal axe, and he says it's one isn't necessarily better than the other in terms of its conception, right? Like a well-made stone axe is just like it's just made out of something different, and it has different uses and different limits, of course, than a completely different material. And we want to kind of be attentive to the material that's being used to construct the tools themselves. But for these lectures, I mean, I always want to dig deeper into the I could just like read through this whole essay with you and it would take all day. But I think that you can see that Saussure's thinking in structuralism is just like fundamental to the ways that Levi-Strauss is constructing his idea of anthropology, and he's using it as a corrective to the way that the field of anthropology has shifted away from comparative religion, comparative mythology of the 19th century, and become quite chaotic. And he wants to bring a more solid sort of discourse. At the same time, he's competing against the so-called hard sciences. This is something that structuralism has always done since the beginning of the 20th century, is it's trying to find a way to scientifically analyze things like culture. And maybe that contradiction is part of the problem of the 20th century, in the sense that we see this growing divide between the so-called sciences and the humanities, right? This is a difficult problem that universities continue to have in the current day, a shift towards STEM research for our schools and for our children, for example, at the expense of philosophy, at the expense of ethics, such that when we get into social problems in the 21st century, such as the conversations around race and racism in the past 10 to 15 years in the United States, we don't have a really good public discourse or discursive ability, because we've had 40 years of overemphasis on the sciences and the math. And so we have like a whole generation of people who can't, think about ethics, whether we're talking about gender or whether we're talking about race or whatever. We're in a chaotic sort of moment for that. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why I'm doing the things that I'm doing and why I'm gauging my discourse towards adults as well. Will I have an impact? I don't know, but I hope so. It gives me something to do. So he says we've distinguished langue and parole by the different time reference which they use. Keeping this in mind, we may notice that myth uses a third referent which combines the properties of the first two. So again, to go back to the pattern that I'm seeing is that we're going to see this kind of like the cross thing, the up, down, the two, and that when we are able to analyze from the static and from the horizontal together, it's going to produce a different kind of meta way of looking at things. That is so structuralist. And it also speaks to what we start calling the language of theory across disciplines as well. I want to say that there's more to what theory is, from my 21st century perspective, but what we're getting at is a kind of way to get to a kind of meta reflection on the ways that things are. And when we're in that meta reflective space and talking, our language is operating in that meta reflective level. And that's why stuff is so hard to understand when you're trying to read theoretical stuff, because you have to go through a kind of hermeneutic process of being able to understand like your way into getting into that discourse. And then once you're in it, you're swimming across various different disciplines, and you're starting to see like, oh, that's the way those folks do it, and that's the way those folks do it. I don't think it needs to be just an impulse towards abstraction, which I think that my indigenous colleagues associate particularly with a Euro-Christian way of doing things. And certainly there is that heavy emphasis on abstraction, whether we're talking about art, whether we're talking about philosophy, whether we're talking about like meta theories of language, for example. But I think that even with current indigenous theory, because that's what I think is like most important to the 2020s, I think, in terms of what we would think of as an ongoing discourse of theory, are those indigenous critiques. I don't think that it always has to be that theory always has to be completely this abstract, murky thing. And I would say, like, just while I'm on the subject, that Leanne Bettisamisake Simpson's book, As We Have Always Done, are Anishinaabe thinkers like Mark Freeland, for example. They really are able to show how world and embodiment and worldview, in a really deep sense of worldview, are able to give us a kind of contrast to the kind of impulses that the earlier structuralists that we see. So if you're interested in that, you can go off on there. I'll return here to Levi-Strauss. He's going to sum up his discussion on the next page. This is on 210 if you are looking at a PDF or something. One of the things that he says interesting is that poetry is a kind of speech which cannot be translated except at the cost of serious distortions, whereas the mythological value of myth is preserved even through the worst translation. Whatever our ignorance of the language and the culture of the people where it originated, a myth is still felt as a myth by any reader anywhere in the world. Its substance does not lie in its style, its original music, or its syntax, but in the story which it tells. Myth is language functioning on the especially high level where meaning succeeds practically at taking off from the linguistic ground on which it keeps on rolling. Okay, so that kind of approach to myth and mythology continues in our universities today. That, like, I could just get a translation. There was a recent translation of the Popol Vuh, the Mayan Popol Vuh, for example. And all I got to do is sort of like I can read the story in English and I basically get the gist of it. And current indigenous thinkers are like, no, that's not really how it works. The Mayan language is especially important for actually trying to understand conceptually how something like Popol Vuh works. But when you teach early students in a university, like in a mythology class, and you're reading most stuff in translation, because that's just what you have to do, there's this tendency to just like put it all into the same mythological universalizing soup that produces bad thinking, the kind of bad thinking that Levi-Strauss earlier accused Jung of doing. I would accuse Levi-Strauss as doing that here. And maybe not Levi-Strauss himself, because I think he's definitely sophisticated enough to say, yes, you need to learn other indigenous languages. But because he's so dedicated to finding this kind of structure that crosses different languages, he misses the nuances and the discreteness of why the different languages exist. And I think that becomes a big part of contemporary indigenous critiques of him. I do think it's interesting to think of poetry as speech, but myth, the idea that myth remains myth across different variations and tellings of the myth. So like you can have like Anne Carson telling a story of a Greek myth, or you could have Sophocles telling the story of a Greek myth. And I think that's what makes a writer and a poet like Anne Carson so important to us today, is because Anne Carson's such a great philosophical and linguistic scholar and poet all at the same time, that when she throws Hegel into a Greek tragedy in her stuff that she's translating. She's able to really address, I think that's in her Antigone version. Uh, she's able to give us a sense of what myth actually does. And we're like, oh, wait, no, myth isn't this thing that just happens in the past and it's like far away from us, like my undergraduate students often think. So I do think that that's an interesting distinction, but like what he's trying to look at in terms of, oh, okay, if we can see the structure of myth, then we can see this thing that happens in human thought that happens behind language as it's produced in performance, as parole, as speech. And I'm not sure that we quite get there. And I'm not sure that even in Levi-Strauss's own thought that it stays that separate, as he's kind of pushing at the end. But for this talk, I'm going to pick on him there. He says, to sum up the discussion at this point, we have so far made the following claims. If there is a meaning to be found in mythology, it cannot reside in the isolated elements which enter into the composition of a myth, but only in the way those elements are combined. First. Second, although myth belongs to the same category as language, being, as a matter of fact, only part of it, language in myth exhibits specific properties. These properties are only to be found above the ordinary linguistic level. That's that shift to the third space. That is, they exhibit the more complex features than those which are to be found in any other kind of linguistic expression. If the above 3 points are granted, at least as a working hypothesis, these two consequences will follow. First, myth, like the rest of language, is made up of constituent units. Second, these constituent units presuppose the constituent units present in language when analyzed on other levels, namely phonemes, morphemes, and sememes, but they nevertheless differ from the latter in the same way that the latter differ among themselves. They belong to a higher and more complex order. For this reason, we shall call them gross constituent units. And this is where he starts getting into the idea of the mytheme. And I would say that the mytheme is kind of parallel to, in Levi-Strauss's thought, to the syntagma in Ferdinand de Saussure's thought earlier on, right? And it both comes from that impulse in structuralism to have the synchronic and the diachronic produce a kind of third space, a kind of above or meta language space, but that then becomes the playground for thinking about how language and how semiotics and meaning itself works. And that's that distinction that Saussure wanted to see at the beginning of his book, where he wants to see linguistics as a branch of a bigger discourse called semiotics. Now, Barth is going to come and tell us something different about that. So I'm just highlighting that as we go along here. So when we go for the mytheme here, I'm going to get to where I have to skip along just for time here in this essay, but definitely worth reading on your own. How shall we proceed in order to identify and isolate these gross constituent units or mythemes? We know that they cannot be found among the phonemes, the morphemes, or the sememes, but only on a higher level. Otherwise, myth would become confused with any other kind of speech. Therefore, we should look for them on the sentence level. The only method we can suggest at this stage is to proceed tentatively by trial and error, using as a check the principles which serve as a basis for any kind of structural analysis: economy of explanation, unity of solution, and ability to reconstruct the whole from a fragment, as well as later stages from the previous ones. Okay, that doesn't sound like a political sentence the way that he described it, but what is buried in that, and this is why he rejects Jung, if you ask me, is that, like, first of all, we're not going to have a sense of the whole picture any more than Ferdinand de Saussure can have a full picture of Proto-Indo-European as a language that's never been written down before, right? All we can do is work from these fragments and see kind of the shadows or the shape of the structure sort of behind them. The mytheme works that way as well, in the sense that we can all sort of piece together these kind of shapes from individual myths, and then we might compare them against other myths. But what we don't want to do, according to Levi-Strauss, is mistake that as a structure of timeless universalness that isn't subject to the diachronic movement or subject to history. This is always going to be the kind of Marxian leftist influences, that there is a sort of notion of historical time and progress, that we must situate things in their contextual historical moment, and we must be able to account for the ways that language or myth changes over time due to the various different conditions that show up socially. Whereas Jung and the idea of archetype theory wants to set itself off into an idea that we can isolate individual structures and then we can pinpoint them and say that they're somehow cross-culturally universal. Like Levi-Strauss would not go there. And that's a really big tension. And that is why, and Jung, this is well known, but Jung himself, why his thought tends towards right-wing thinking, why he flirted, and at least later on in his life kind of apologized for it. Jung saw a kind of potential in fascism, right? In right-wing movements, because that fascism, whether we're talking about with like Heidegger's philosophical appeal, it still engages with these structures, perhaps pushes too far in the essentialism of those structures, but nevertheless comes with an aspiration. When you're thinking about how does this make a play in the world, it pushes us towards a society that has a much more conservative sort of base structure, to use Marx's terms there. And I think that it's ahistorical, like think about, not like a easy examples like Nazi book burning, right? That we can start history over again because we can really just think in terms of this kind of abstract science that doesn't have any historical sense that matters, right? I was driving down the street a few weeks ago and I ended up behind a car, that was just like covered with bumper stickers about, drop all your money, invest in Bitcoin, invest in Ethereum, crypto. And then another sticker on the same car that just said, history doesn't matter. It's just all stories. It's just all made up anyway. And so just give it all up and enter the AI universe or something. Like, I think that this is where, like if we're turning back to structuralist theory, for whatever its flaws are, I think that the impulses, the subtlety of the impulse, that yes, it is leftist thought, right, politically in structuralism. That's maybe something that we want to that critique is something that we might want to bring into 21st century encounters with the crypto Bitcoin car that has like no history. And because I don't know what that person's personal politics are, but that is exactly the kind of impulse that leads towards politics of purity and that leads towards politics of speed and fascism, especially in the far right variants of it. So if I come back to Levi-Strauss here, he moves from the mytheme and he wants to give us some specific examples. And this is what I said I wasn't going to go into too much. He said he uses Oedipus as an example, though, and he says, "Yes, I know that by looking at Oedipus, we're already seeing something written down by a Greek figure like Socrates. So for anthropologists, that's coming pretty late in the game for thinking about myth, because we're starting to think of it as literature because it's been written down instead of in its sort of pre, like like the space where it exists across beings, like a language exists across a different community, or across a community of individuals, that they inhabit within, right? So we're not looking at a piece of writing, and he's going to have that same kind of disdain for writing that Saussure has. And the later post-structuralists like Jacques Derrida are going to reverse that and have a different way of thinking about writing itself. Interestingly, in the way that, and I'm going to show this kind of close here, up here you can see maybe, um, he wants to try and read a myth, like setting it up like a symphony. Like if we were able to look at the chart of, I don't know, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and you have all of the different individual parts for individual instruments, and so we're looking at the whole score as if we're the conductor. That's what the mythologist is trying to do. Is like they have like a blank sheet of music, and they're trying to like transcribe, in a sense, the different parts and the different instruments. And so you have that kind of vertical structure, and then in music, and then in written music, and then you have that it exists across time, right, horizontally. And you can see the different sort of big moments popping up between the different instruments when they're in orchestration with each other. And I actually, like that idea for understanding literature and myth in general. And he says that we can thus find ourselves. He's got I'll try it again here. So he's like maps out 4 different columns for the events that are happening in Oedipus, and I'm not going to go in depth here, but he says we thus find ourselves confronted with 4 vertical columns, each of which includes several relations belonging to the same bundle. Were we to tell the myth, we would disregard the columns and read the rows from left to right, and from top to bottom. But if we want to understand the myth, then we have to disregard one half of the diachronic dimension, top to bottom, and read from left to right, column after column, each being considered as a unit. It's a way of sort of breaking things up. And that's his method there. And so I think I'm making my point here, at least in terms of like getting you to understand the kind of stylistic similarity in this thing called structuralism between Saussure and between Claude Levi-Strauss. So I'm going to continue down with my notes here. That question: if the content of a myth is contingent, how are we going to explain the fact that myths are that myths throughout the world are so similar? He says that myth is language, myth is long. The tellings of myths are parole, though, so it's harder to separate the two out there. He said that stuff about poetry. I compared it to the Popol Vuh, as I said I would. And then the mytheme we get, and then he suggests these comparative storyboards that I was just describing. He says, since the purpose of myth, later on in his essay, is to provide a logical model capable of overcoming a contradiction, an impossible achievement if, as it happens, the contradiction is real. A theoretically infinite number of slates will be generated, each one slightly different from the others. Thus, myth grows spiral-wise. And this is like if somebody was teaching like a first-year seminar or something, they might do is just like they might draw the spiral, and that's the way that Levi-Strauss conceives it. But he says the myth grows spiral-wise until the intellectual impulse which has produced it is exhausted. Its growth is a continuous process, whereas its structure remains discontinuous. And I think those last few words, where he wants to maintain the idea of a static structure that's discontinuous, well, in addition to having this kind of ever-evolving spiral sort of thing coming through the existence through time, that's probably what keeps him as a structuralist at this moment and not a post-structuralist, because I think what the post-structuralists are going to challenge is just how static that or discontinuous the structure itself could be. What deconstruction from Derrida's sort of conception of it is that even those big hard structures, they are the things that sort of devolve and fragment over time. And we see fragmentation showing up in Levi-Strauss. We see fragmentation showing up in the idea of difference, all the way back into Ferdinand de Saussure. And so, like, as Paul Fry, as other thinkers have pointed out, I think like it's not to say that Derrida says something that isn't already in structuralism, and that's why we don't want to think of post-structuralism as just an opposite or a critique or even just a critique, but sometimes as a radicalization of elements that were already in structuralism to begin with. And of course, as I've said, and many other people have said, American thinkers have tended to like create a cottage industry around this thing called post-structuralism, whereas maybe on the continent of Europe, like they were just always that we didn't have the post; it was just always just structuralist thinking. That the discourse changed, yeah. And that has to do with American politics and stuff that maybe we'll get to in another lecture. If our interpretation is correct, he says, we are led to a completely different view, namely that the kind of logic in mythological thought is as rigorous as that of modern science, and that the real difference lies not in the equality of the intellectual processes, but in the nature of things to which it is applied. And from that, he goes on to end his essay by emphasizing the fact that people, of course, should not be thinking of so-called primitive man, or by which he also means currently living indigenous people, as in any way inferior or living in a time in the past necessarily, but that there is a different sort of use of material and a different sort of use of tools, and that the language that used to understand the world and how the universe and how it works that might work mythologically is maybe a different tool than the discourse of science that is so esteemed in Euro-Christian culture. And so if I just read a couple of little last passages here to end, this is on 229 he says myth 229 and 230, the last two pages here. He says, again, its growth is a continuous process where its structure remains discontinuous. If this is the case, we should assume that it closely corresponds in the realm of the spoken word to a crystal in the realm of physical matter. This analogy may help us to better understand the relationship of myth to both Long on the one hand and parole on the other. Myth is an intermediary entity between the statistical aggregate of molecules and the molecular structure itself. Now, DNA had just been discovered in the 40s too, and so I think he's definitely got that kind of scientific discourse on his brain there. He says prevalent attempts to explain alleged differences between the so-called primitive mind and scientific thought have resorted to qualitative differences between the working processes of the mind in both cases, while assuming that the entities which they were studying remain very much the same. If our interpretation is correct, we are led toward a completely different view, namely that the kind of logic in mythical thought is as rigorous as that of modern science, and that the difference lies not in the quality of the intellectual process, but in the nature of things to which it is applied. This is well in agreement with the situation known to prevail in the field of technology. What makes a steel axe superior to a stone axe is not that the first one is better made than the second. They are equally well made, but steel is quite different from stone. In the same way, we may be able to show that the same logical processes operate in myth as in science, and that man has always been thinking equally well. The improvement lies not in the alleged progress of man's mind, but in the discovery of new areas to which it may apply its unchanged and unchanging powers. Okay, later folks, cognitive scientists will qualify some of the stuff that he's getting towards at the end there, but there definitely you can hear that there are cross-cultural and therefore political consequences to Levi-Strauss's theory, and he definitely sees himself as championing indigenous folks from around the world, and at least in his context, I think he is doing that a little bit, but there's a lot more to be said by actual indigenous people about the ways that mythology works without being able to just jump to the meta linguistic third space, third realm that the Euro-Christian writers and thinkers that I've mostly been covering so far in these lectures. And of course, remember I've mentioned Freud, for example, who's Jewish. And I'm not talking about a religious disposition or even a racial disposition. I'm talking about a worldview disposition, all Euro-Christian, all one word, lowercase, as having a very dominant socio-political impact, especially over the past 500 to 600 years on the planet. I'm going to stop there, and we're going to move on to Roland Barthes in the next series of lectures on structuralism. Please support us on Patreon if you can, if you want to, if you're getting things out of this. Have a lovely day, evening, night, morning, wherever, whenever you are. Stop sharing. Bye.